So I think the first question we want to start with is the case study we used today. Because the case study, I saw some of you gasp when she put 27 million to 60 million. Everybody saw that. That was a 60M for million. And probably, given that we have so many million-dollar organizations, you were like, well, that's not our situation. So I think the first question is, does every business model need to have a perfect mix? Like, do all business models have to have earned revenue? Do all business models have to be heavy on private philanthropy? Is there a one-size-fits-all business model? And so I want to kind of start with asking Craig that, and then have Janet follow up by commenting on the fact that she started off, just she and Ellen and a few others, building a very small little pilot. And that was in 1998. And it's a pretty amazing story of how quickly this organization has scaled to $60 million. So there's some reason, or is moving toward a 2018 goal of 60 million in annual revenue, right?
We're about 35 to 40 right now.
35 to 40 right now, moving to 60 million. And my guess is you're pretty confident you're going to get there.
Sure.
And you're
we are confident that we have the ability to get there.
So we want to also spend some time understanding what pieces of this are really relevant for smaller organizations. What are some of the key takeaways? I don't think we're saying today every organization has to grow to be a $60 million organization. I think what we're more interested in today is what helped drive growth and sustainability. Not necessarily the scale of the growth. That's not what's being advocated for here. It's more what starts creating that healthy trend where those lines are crossing. Remember Craig's diagram that there's like this magical moment where the lines cross and suddenly you've got a little margin, you're bringing in a little more than you're spending, and you're sustaining that. So.
The short answer to your question is that there is no magic secret sauce. If you Google the nonprofit business model, you'll find a whole lot of articles, and I would recommend not reading any of those. Anybody who thinks there's only one probably has missed the boat. The combination of those revenue streams should fit what's realistic for your practice. There was some excellent work done by one of our periodic collaborators and competitors, the Bridgespan Group, that described that high potential growing nonprofits typically had a collection of different payers within one core funding type. So revenue diversity is really important to all of us. If you only have one payer, life is really hard. But it's not necessarily important that it be a mix of earned and fee if you have, or contributed. If you have, I like Downton Abbey, and it turns out that PBS does just fine with a very, very wide set of contributed revenue folks. So there's a lot of diversity of that funding. It is not essential that they go and have a large earned revenue component to that, a modest one. But I think what's important is to have a model, to know what it is, and to manage yourselves to make that work. There is no one size fits all, and there is no natural preference for one of those types of revenue being more effective than the others.
So would it be safe to say it's good to have at least two kinds of revenue? I mean, or is that even a simplistic notion?
For the majority of organizations we see, a mix tends to work better than having only one. That isn't necessarily a better thing. I think there are a handful of really good examples of folks who have exactly one type of business model revenue and do brilliantly well. I would not generally advise that one have multiple, but I would say that for the majority of places that we see, the right answer tends to be that there's a dominant revenue stream and there's a supporting revenue stream. The folks who tend to have 10 find that tends to get harder to manage. That's very tough, but most people tend to have probably two or three.
So just your question was kind of what in our trajectory helped us get to a place of growth and kind of accelerate our growth, or did you want me to respond to kind of revenue stream?
Well, why don't you do a little bit of both?
Okay.
Why don't you respond to that and then? Yeah.
So we were lucky enough that from the very beginning, because we were born out of a program on the ground. Our genesis predated even the center. It was a program. And so what the original funders, when they came to us, they wanted us to replicate that program for a fee. And so we from the very get-go, had diversity of funding. We had foundation philanthropy, and we had clients, external entities willing to pay a price for what we were delivering, consultation and professional development. That gave us from the get-go diversity of funding, and we were very conscious early on that we needed to build both of those things. We realized, and maybe it was just, we were lucky enough to have good advice. We were very lucky early on, probably our 4th year, to be connected with someone who had previously been with Bain and was working pro bono with not-for-profits to advise around a business model, and our funders demanded a business model from us. And we were so excited, we put together a strategic plan, and it got shot out of the room. I'll never forget, probably one of the most embarrassing moments was come to the funders with a strategic plan when they wanted a business model. And we learned very quickly that one is not the other, and being forced to deliver the business model back in 2002, 2003, it was fiscal year 2003, it forced us to think differently. And I'd say it was it was a kick in the seat of the pants. And it was the first time ever we started saying, what are our margins? How much does it cost to deliver? Not with the Excel spreadsheet sort of fine granularity we have now, but it was at least at the 40,000 foot level, we were forced to say, so what is the cost of our services? Is this a sustainable income? What does that look like for how much can go to overhead? What is our overhead? And what then does philanthropy, what does that revenue help us out? Not that we had the vocabulary yet to be articulate, but we at least had the consciousness. And I think the other thing that has really accelerated us, Alexa, is that I want to credit Ellen and her ability to tell the story to funders and talk the language of organizational growth. It's hard to, you almost start feeling like you're a supplicant, and you're trying to, it's like you're a snake oil salesman or something. You're trying to sell your organization rather than your impact. And being able to weave the story of the impact with the need for organizational development is a masterful one to tell, and it's a powerful one. But it's one that I think, and as I'm seeing the poll, is absolutely critical for the growth. I mean, we started working with a marketing consultant. We were lucky enough to get pro bono, but we got marketers in to teach us how to talk the language of marketing ourselves. And it was a different way of thinking. We're all educators, by the way. We were all classroom teachers who ended up founding this organization. So having someone teach us how to talk an entirely different vocabulary was huge.
I guess I'd just like to add a perspective over time, which is a lot of these questions about what should a business model look like, we feel like there's a right answer, and those right answers tend to be really faddish. And sometimes it's good to jump on the fad because there's dollars associated with it, but it's really helpful to be aware that they tend to be a fad. So in the 60s and 70s, social services were two things. There's big government and there's charitable activity, and they were thought of fairly independently that way. And I think there was a perception that a lot of that didn't work as well as one might hope. In the 80s and particularly the 90s, capacity building became a buzzword, and there was a lot of investment in the interest of professionalizing the delivery and operations, and there's a lot of truth to that. It also meant that people invested huge sums in building capacity for organizations that didn't have a sense of how they were going to sustain themselves over time, and they might have been disillusioned on the far side of that for pretty good reasons. And so we came out of that, and in much of the last decade, there seemed to be this fetish for earned revenue or the social enterprise model or whatever we might call it. And that seemed like that was going to cure all of our ails, and getting better at that was helpful for us in the sector. And then in the Great Recession, all of those funds dried up and our service delivery shrank rather than growing, right, because demand was going the other way. And people said, well, that's not sufficient. And so now there's sort of a resurgence of thinking about contributed resources as being part of that. And I think there's a piece about, well, if we just tied everything to outcomes, and we're deeply invested in pay for success work and outcomes-based financing, and maybe that's the fad right now. And just like the last four, there's some great truth in that, and there's a whole lot of fluff that's going to make a lot of money slosh around. And sort of being stable about that and not getting too drawn in of the fetish of the day, and instead being true to what's the business you want to run and how do you envision making a difference and getting that paid for, is really, really helpful.
So one of the things, I'm multitasking, watching some of your questions coming on the screen. Luckily, I sat in this chair so I could see them. And so there's an interesting set of questions about learning this language of growth. But there's a fundamental question that's been brought up is, what is scale? What is scale for a food bank? What is scale for an urban youth program? What is scale for whatever it would be? And I think that was, for New Teacher Center, where you do have an earned revenue model, districts are willing to pay for part of the cost. And you said N equals all, meaning you want to touch every teacher in the country with a mentor or some kind of support system. You want to improve the way teachers come into the system and how quickly they're able to teach at a high quality, particularly to low-income students. For you, you have found a model where you actually think you can scale to affect teacher training across this country in every urban school district. Because you have a business model that's doing that. For others, though, a business model for urban youth, or may not include earned revenue. Urban youth can't pay to be served, and there may not be a system that will pay for that for them to be served. Although in some school districts they might pay for urban youth to have extended learning time, right? There may be ways that people want to pay for that, but in some programs there will not be that kind of payer, that kind of buyer of that service.
I think one thing that is unique about our methodology and model that is standing us in really good stead, enabling us to scale, is that we are not about putting our program on the ground. We're about building the capacity of the partnering organization to put its program on the ground. So we are a capacity building organization. We don't want to run a stable of mentors. That's a horrible metaphor. We do not want to have mentors out in the field we're paying for, that are our staff members. We want to build the entities, the partnering entities' capacity to do it. And we actually have a capacity building model over 5 years where we deliver the services for the first 3, we co-deliver the services for the next 2, and then beyond 5 years, we are in a membership phase, a consultative phase. So for better or for worse, and this is one problem with our business model, is if you think of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Little Prince, and the drawing on the first pages of a snake that swallowed an elephant, and you see kind of a elongated bell curve with a very long tail, that's our business model, okay? It's a little bit worrisome because it means we constantly have to be bringing in new clients in order to sustain because of the tail. So the first part is a little thick capacity building to begin with, startup, and then really thick, and then this long tail. The result is it enables us to scale without us having to deliver the program. We're building the capacity of others to deliver the program.
You're building the capacity of school districts.
Correct.
To create mentors on the ground.
Correct.
Who they employ.
Correct.
To match them with teachers, and you're creating that capacity.
And they use our materials.
Right.
And so there's an annual fee for our materials, which are online, which has a little higher margin, but quite frankly, technical support and ongoing updating, it's amazing how quickly that margin.
Yeah, so this is where the theory of change, which has also been a theme of this series, Janet started by showing her theory of change, and some of us might have gone, I thought I was here to hear about business models, it's really interesting. She has this theory of change, but it starts with the role you're playing and how you're going to deliver that service directly then correlates to the business model you're going to build, right? And so that's one example.
First step that we needed to do in order to create a more robust business model.
Yeah, there was a question earlier about strategic planning and how all this fits in. And I think these are all pieces of a really well thought out strategic plan. You have your theory of change, you have your business model, and usually with a strategic plan, you also are articulating 3 to 5 year goals and implementation strategies. But often people go into their strategic plan articulating goals and strategies without stepping back, saying, what's my theory of change? How am I delivering this impact in the world? What's my role? Am I a capacity builder? Am I a direct service provider? What am I? And then really figuring out the business model. But I do want to ask Craig about how you define scale, because I think fundamentally people are grappling with that question in the audience, and then also grappling with the kinds of vendors, partners, all these lucky breaks. How do you actually think about that more in terms of how you bring the right kind of thought partnership around you to get some of this work done?
So I think scale's hard, and the answer is it depends. there are three things that are really important, one far more so than the others. The first thing that's really important is that scale is the scale that's required for you to deliver on your chosen mission. The challenge of leadership and governance is that you get to make that choice. There are loud, powerful, often very smart voices that will try to influence that voice. There are an awful lot of funders who tell you that the right version of scale is that you need to touch every student in the country or whatever your program might be. It may be that as a governance set, your board, your leadership, the right scale for you is that you want to prove that something works so that other people might copy it, and that's very small. Or it may be that what you really want to do is to make sure that for 3 square blocks in East Palo Alto, nobody's hungry. These are great things to do. The right scale for delivering your mission is a choice, and it's one you should never abdicate to the stakeholders that are outside. It's something that your governance and leadership really, that's a huge responsibility, and lots of other decisions come from it. So that's the most important. The second most important is that for many business models, there's a minimum efficient scale to work. And it costs an awful lot to be too small because you're paying for a part-time bookkeeper instead of being at a scale where you have a CFO. You need to pay to rent all sorts of things instead of owning things that are much more efficient. That way you don't have full staff, you don't have continuity. People wear 7 hats and don't do any of them well. There are lots of reasons that being too small is really expensive. So as part of making that choice, being thoughtful about what are the economics of your chosen business model, cost structure and revenue, that sort of make it have a reasonable cost for each individual that you serve, so that can actually work. That's important. So that's a critical consideration there. And then the last thing is the part that I've been learning lately that I didn't believe before, which is that it's incredibly hard to be in an organization that's not growing. I thought that small is beautiful. I liked that theory. And in a few cases that's true, but in an awful lot of cases it's really hard to keep the attention of your best people internally and externally. So I do think that the answer often is that scale is a little bigger than you were before. And that tends to be more important than I ever would have given it credit for. But those are the three things that we think about. Most important, it is a choice, and it's a choice you should make, and it's a choice you should revisit. Let yourself be challenged on it, but know that that's a leadership and governance choice.
So before I turn it over, we'll have microphones in a moment to turn it over for your questions. There's one last provocative comment up on the screen that's really about, is this just a reframing of overhead? This idea of build versus buy. Is build really just code word for overhead, maybe repositioned or reframed? So let's talk about that a bit. And what I really love about your slide, Janet, is when you put up your buy and build revenue, you have fair share of overhead. So you use that word overtly as one piece of build. And then there's also another question about just what percentage of build revenue is appropriate. Is there any kind of rule of thumb about what build revenue should look like? And then we'll start opening it up because there's a lot more questions.
So just from NTC's kind of perspective, from the micro to the macro, we definitely distinguish build and buy from overhead. Overhead are those consistent, ongoing infrastructural elements of our organization that need to exist on behalf of program delivery as well as on behalf of build initiatives. Build initiatives are things that are going to take us to the next level. They are one time. They are not necessarily ongoing. They're going to fluctuate. They're going to go like this. This year, like next year, what we realized is we needed to shift some of our growth capital. This is a little small example. We thought last year was going to get us out of the blocks with our online growth. We invested in content to make sure we had online content across all subject matters, across all grade levels, so that we could really put it out there. We didn't see an uptake. There was not an uptake just by making, you build it and they will come. They didn't come. So what we're saying is we need to take some of the build dollars that we have in this growth capital, this one-time growth capital opportunity, and reposition them behind the sale of that, the marketing and sale. So this coming year, we made some shifts. We hired someone to look explicitly at that marketing, that sales, and also some additional collateral to help reframe that and put it out there in a different way. That to us is build. Overhead is whether or not our bills get paid and whether or not our salaries and benefits packages are, concomitant with what we aspire to be as an organization.
I have a point of view about this one. There's an awful lot of overhead that gets packaged up and sold to funders as build opportunities. That happens. I think that it dilutes and distracts, and it's a challenge, and it's the biggest challenge we face in trying to send a message about a healthy way of thinking about your business. I don't think, over long periods of time, that it is simply a new way to package overhead. I think overhead is part of the total cost structure that needs to be paid for by revenue over long periods of time. Absolutely essential component of what sustainability means to us. The build dollars tend to be episodic. It's, I'm getting something started, I'm growing and expanding, I'm reinventing the technology platform, it's something. And in the healthy applications of it that we see, it is always in service of a vision of sustainability down the future, and the way you measure whether it worked isn't whether you spent it all or whether it paid for those things. It's whether on the far side there's a sustainable business that you can point to. If it didn't, it was attempted build dollars that happened to fall flat. So sustainability need to cover cost of overhead on an ongoing basis, and successful building puts you there. In the short term, often it pays for overhead as you're ramping up. If you're going to launch a new enterprise and the first thing you need to do is hire 3 staff and get a roof over your head so that you can start talking to funders and you can start building the practice, it may pay for that overhead in the short term, but I think that can only be a very short interim period. And the other question was about the proportion. I don't think that there's an appropriate or healthy steady state for the difference. The build dollars tend to be episodic. They're at points of turbulence and change. They're bigger rather than smaller. And points of stability, they should be smaller or zero. In the whole picture, the vast majority of the dollars should pay you to do the things that you're going to do. So if you take any long period of time, I would expect that the buy dollars are a significant multiple of the build dollars. That may not be true in 1 year, but over any 5 or 8 year period, that would be the case. I'm pretty sure that's the case in the proportion of your revenue. You drew a picture of growing from $27 to $60 million, which is a 5-year time horizon with $200 million of total revenue. And the build dollars that unlocked that were a very small fraction. 16?
16 build.
And
over 5 years.
That kind of relationship, that kind of ratio is very much what we're seeing in high-performing organizations that are using that are using build dollars effectively. I think that's not at all out of bounds. What's that? A little more than 10 to 1 over the plan horizon. Right. That's pretty normative. There is a business model which says I'm going to go raise a bunch of things, call them build dollars, call it innovation, and it's I'm going to go from planning grant to planning grant to planning grant. That's a successful way of raising dollars. We don't think it's a successful way of building businesses.
It's also generally. It's a killer to do that. I mean, it's really a lot of work. We're also aspiring to have a model of about 75% buy to 25% everything else and build. That's and I don't know. It may not be totally build because we do have some funders. And that's philanthropy that's not buying services, but they are supporting overhead. They really do. We have a few, not a lot, but we do have a few that do support overhead, and also we do get, of course, the overhead costs associated with our grants. We're not sure. That's what we aspire to be. We're not there yet. We are probably more, right now, our revenue from our grants is about 50% of our total revenue, but of that, about 50% of that is for service. But then on top, that's our standard revenue. So 50% of our philanthropy dollars are buy dollars, third-party buy. On top of that is the build. Okay? So
and sometimes that may be the same funder, and sometimes it
exactly,
might be different. They'll do a little bit of buying, and they'll do a little bit of building. Okay, so your questions. Are we ready to? And I'm also noticing that you're answering each other's questions, which is so awesome of you. You're referring people. There's a lot of discussion about finding pro bono consultants, finding consultants you pay for. Yep. There's also funders who will sometimes help you with consultants. Yep. if you're brave enough to have that conversation. I know that, some foundations have extra money for grantees sometimes to do some of the planning work that they need to do, not all, but some. But Taproot, LinkedIn, Volunteer Match, or somebody cited a book I really want to know more about called Small Giants, companies that choose to be great instead of big, so you can be a small, sustainable nonprofit. That can be your scale depending on what your model is and what kind of choices you're making. Okay, you get the first question.
Okay, so here's a question. Do you see a role for small foundations with grant sizes typically between $10,000 and $50,000 in supporting build efforts? That's one part. And the other part is, do you consider general operating support build money?
I can't imagine the answer to that would be no.
Right. Some of our first support in marketing was an under $40,000 grant from it was from Full Circle Fund in San Francisco, and it was humongous. It took us from awareness to not anywhere close to expertise, but took us to a level, actually it even took us to awareness. And really took us to a place of new thinking, which has influenced us even today. And it was a $40,000 investment.
Yes.
But it's very targeted, though. This is where I think targeted investments at that level. Now, big targeted is sometimes dangerous because it becomes restrictive. But small targeted can be accelerant and like a little pinprick. And can be. I think we've benefited from that ongoingly.
How about the general operating support aspect of that?
I think general operating support can play either role. It can be a subsidy for a business model whose other payers don't pay for the whole thing, and that is a fantastic thing. It's probably my favorite role that I see foundations play in our communities. It can also be a way to take dollars to experiment and try things that are new. The program around separating building and buying that we started in our nonprofit was kicked off with a $25,000 grant, and that was powerful, and it's part of the reason that I'm sitting here today. So yes, I think there can be a useful role. I think the cautions are that sometimes people think it's sexier to play on the build side. I don't know whether that's helpful or not. I don't think that I don't have a value sense that that's a better thing. I just think it's healthy to think about it differently. One of the most expensive things that a small grant maker can do is to be an expensive person to court. And so if you want the full factory tour and you want to meet the staff and you want all of the hand holding that takes a lot of time, and you want to do that for a $15,000 grant, you should recognize that the net value of that you're conferring to the organization is small or maybe negative. But I think being mindful of how you sit within the whole framework for the organization is helpful. But there are very powerful, useful things that can happen both by unlocking other buy dollars by being the complementary resource, a subsidy for some of that cost that otherwise doesn't get covered, or by playing a catalytic role as a build seed. And I think both of those are worthy of our time.
I think, just if I can add, there's another way in which we've seen small grant and funders really be catalytic is in the area of buy as well. It can lead, it can incentivize. So that's another way in which we find that useful.
You're next.
The question I had is, how do you determine cost? The current way we do it, I don't think is real cost. We divide the number of people by the budget we have. And we use FTEs and we spread admin across, but somehow it seems like that's the current snap, but I don't know if there's another way to determine what's really, what it really costs you to run any program or organization.
Shall I?
Yeah.
So the answer is there are a lot of ways to think about cost, and they all have a place and their merit. Average cost to serve is a great measure for cost. It is a starting point, and I would never talk to and engage a client without starting with understanding that. It's also really important to know marginal cost. What does it take to add one more person, or how much cost does it come down to reduce the role of folks you're serving by one? That's a really big deal. Sometimes total cost matters a lot because You may have an average cost per funder, or per person served, but the truth of the matter is that you can't pay the mortgage if you don't have a certain number of those folks that are there. So the fact that your total cost is $800,000 as opposed to thinking of it as $20,000 per the person that you're serving is really, really important. You aren't totally flexible in going up and down. So I think there are a variety of ways to think about what the metric is. Whatever the case is and what you're using, I think it's really helpful to be very clear about what the direct cost to serve is, what the overhead is, what the amortized costs are, and what the financing costs are. And if you don't have all of those, you're probably understating what your total cost to serve is in most cases.
Next question. Kavitha, do you have another one? Anybody else? Somebody over here? No more questions? Here in the front.
So going back to what you were saying about culture and retaining staff, how has your staffing or the skill set that you needed from your team evolved over time as your organization has grown so rapidly? And have you had to lose people and bring new people on with a different skill set to meet the scale of your organization? And how has that impacted your organization?
It's huge. The way in which it's changed, the impact is maybe not as huge because we've really attended to culture, but to give you kind of a trajectory and a few examples. As I said, we started off literally as former classroom teachers who were employed by University of California, Santa Cruz as part of the teacher ed department, and we're delivering a service on the ground in the surrounding the geographically located schools. We had no business expertise. We had no organizational expertise other than having existed in K-12 school systems and the university. So lowercase expertise. We started growing, and we needed, from the very beginning to be able to deliver on the ground, and we tended to bring in other educators. Our pipeline was our local program. So if you were a good mentor, then you became a better mentor leader, and then you became part of the new teacher center at the university. That was our pipeline, and our culture reflected that. It was a kind of a K-12 or a university culture, a blend of the two. I think the biggest shift came when we relied upon the university, by the way, for all those the back office. So we didn't even need to pay attention. We didn't have we had a contracts manager that was located at our center but was reported to the division. Our HR was totally run by the division at UC. We were in a sheltered environment, and I think the second phase came when the university said you need to take responsibility for some of this fiscal stuff and made us start having on-site greater capacity. And that included having a chief operating officer, although it was called just an operating officer at the time, and a financial person. And that person was drawn from the world of not-for-profits, but had an MBA, did not have educator experience. It was a significant shift in our mentality, and as we built ourselves up for 2.0, which was leaving the university, the culture shifted dramatically, because all of a sudden we went from having maybe 5 or 6 folks at the university linked to now we have a business office of over 48 people. Our business and operations team. 1 in 4 is business office. And they have brought a wealth of knowledge and a perspective that has shot us forward. The cultural implications are having to kind of tend to the sense of well-being of everybody who doesn't even have that, and teach being transparent and teach the vocabulary without disenfranchising or disempowering those who have been really up until then very successful at taking an organization from 0 to 150 people without that. I think what we had to do was just really work hard to make sure we were talking the same language, being incredibly transparent, being honoring of existing expertise while saying this is what we need. And right now, I'd say we're in the next phase of that, is saying, in order to do this scale and go, to double in impact, what are the gaps? And there were a couple of gaps, and I'll admit I was anti even filling them. One of them was the sales function. We were doing pretty well with sales. I mean, we were growing, if you can think of our trajectory over many, many years, and the sales were our program people. I was in charge of our growth and client engagement. We called it program engagement. We didn't call it sales, and we probably still won't call it sales, because in K-12 education, that oftentimes meets with closed doors. But I resisted that, saying, we're doing okay. All we need to do is add more resources. And we made a shift a year ago when we realized that if we were going to accelerate the way we wanted to, we needed different expertise and dedicated knowledge and resources. It's a constant, ongoing, however, effort to maintain culture and honor all voices at the table.
So one of the things, okay, we'll go here and here. Are you ready? Great, we'll get you. One of the things we should talk about is this issue of actually how you ask funders for hard things, like cash reserves. That came up, but I want to go to
This
you
is
guys.
just one more quick follow-up on scale, and it's a little bit of a program question, but how are you ensuring fidelity to the model? And I can imagine that the more you seek that, there's a cost involved, and has your organization shifted its mission a little bit around fidelity as you go?
So what we have, and I said the tension between cookie cutter and innovation, we have tried to, over the course of the last 5 years, become extraordinarily articulate about what are the structures and tools that we need in order to deliver a consistently high quality product in the field. We've articulated it, we've created protocols for our own staff so that we can monitor in the field what gets delivered. Now, from the standpoint of the customer or the client, it feels contextualized all the time because we contextualize the knowledge as the program person goes out there, but we have created templates, resources that are internally used to support replicability and quality. Our biggest thing is when we add in innovation, because we also, a couple years ago, revised our work for, and we are with Common Core, college and career-ready standards going out across the country, and some of the changes concomitant with that, we are having to even now continue to revise with a little quicker timeline than we anticipated. We are really looking carefully at what are the things we need to do, and that investment we are selling as a build investment. We are actually selling that to funders.
I think we have one. We'll take one last question.
Thanks. I have a question around messaging.
Oh, and then one more.
I think messaging has become one of sort of a critical component in terms of doing or conducting your day-to-day business. So if you could maybe share some thoughts around messaging and telling the story, that's very, very important. And then second, and probably a second part to that also, is the role of social media and how social media is playing such a critical impact on both the buy but also on the sell model. So if you could please elaborate on that as well. Thank you.
So this really goes to this issue of telling the story. How do you message the story? What are we learning about that?
So it's hard. There's an old saying that if you've talked to one funder, you've talked to one funder. And that's absolutely true. A couple of things I would say about messaging is I don't believe in Gnostic fundraising. There isn't going to be some epiphany where you understand your business brilliantly well and are fabulous at delivering it the first time you do it. The process of messaging is a learned skill and a practiced skill, which means a few things. The first is that the way to do it is to start by doing it and do it a lot and talk to a lot of people and have people you trust in the room who can give you feedback about what's working and what's not, because most of the time when we're pitching, we're misreading our audience pretty badly. Don't start with your most important funder. If the make or break for your plan is somebody that you can name, that is the worst person to talk to first. Get better at telling your story early. I think it's really important to understand the mindset of the person who you're talking to. So the first part of messaging well is to listen well so that you know who you're talking to. And I think the follow-on question about social media, one of the great challenges about that on these topics is that an awful lot of social media is broadcast to wide audiences, and you can't figure out which part of the elephant to describe very gracefully because you can't listen first. And if you can't listen first, you probably can't figure out what the interest of your counterparty is. And if you can't do that, it's really hard to sell it. So I think those are important pieces. Figuring out how to take the relatively complex math about what does the revenue stream look like and what's the cost structure and how do we think about that, and distilling it to a few sentences so that you can use it as a wrapper for your mission story, which is the reason the other person's in the room. Incredibly important. The sort of classic blunder, the thing you never want to do, is to lose the passion about what you're doing because you are being so wonky talking about what it costs to do it. Figuring out how to be honest and intellectually rigorous, and then distill it to very simple phrases, critically important. And then take feedback, figure out what works and what doesn't. Your goal is not that 100% of your conversations turn into checks, but you should see what the behavior of the people you're pitching is in response to the way that you describe it and learn. I think there's just absolutely no substitute for the process of practice and learning on it.
Great. We have one final one, and then we're going to have to shut down. Yeah.
Just one comment, because I really
Yeah.
appreciate everything you said. And I'd add, what we found that a piece of the message is relationship. There's an interpersonal human side to it. It isn't necessarily the story, it's the relationship you're building in the moment with the person who's listening to you. And in our funding efforts, our development efforts, it is interpersonal. It really comes down, and I know you captured it by saying it's about listening. It's about hearing and then adjusting your message in response to that. And it also, the second thing that we've learned is that it really is about the story of the impact. And it isn't about us telling about it. We found that sometimes our most powerful stories are when we bring a beginning teacher and a mentor to a community of funders or a funders briefing that we're setting up and let them talk. We don't talk. They talk. They talk about why they're still teaching and what it is that drives them on a daily basis and the impact it's having upon kids. And it's their message is as powerful as the corporate message, and not losing sight of that level of I guess, interpersonal.
Right. Great. Excellent. Yes. You're the last one.
Just very quickly, I was just curious about board members, and I know they have an important role in all of this, but if they don't come along, it's very, very difficult. I had been to one of the previous sessions in the previous series with the theory of change and all of that, and how board members, kind of start there. But I was curious in terms of getting to where you are. I wonder about changes on your board, the roles people play, that sort of thing.
I'll start. We have a board, have only had a board since 2009, actually 2008. We became a 501c3 the year before we exited the university. And the board chair is a pretty extraordinary person who was actually the person who helped us consider leaving university. I don't know if any of you know Lance Force, president of Silicon Valley Community Foundation, and it's a joint venture.
SV2.
SV2,
Yeah,
sorry, not the
Valley
Community Foundation, right? And he learned about our organization before the board was even created, and we had that benefit. The other thing is we populated that board with people who knew our work to begin with. So our founding board members were 4 people who had been long-term angels to us and had been shepherding us along organizationally. They came with a strong knowledge of our work, and that was something we could build upon. We've had great longevity in our board members. The places where we've had greatest churn are the board members that are situated by the venture philanthropy organizations that require a board seat, and that's where we've seen churn. But we've made sure that we maintain enough board positions that are not related to the venture philanthropy positions that are required by those gives. We also have what we call a generative board, in that they want to be involved in the thinking, and we factor that and we co-create the board agenda with Lance and make sure that there's an opportunity for discussion around hot topics or topics they're interested in, because that's the easiest way to calibrate a board.
Yeah.
Is to talk about it.
Yeah, this is a whole session. We need that would be a whole separate topic.
Yeah.
I also would just add, in conclusion, we're going to have you get out your cell phones to just give us some quick feedback. But I also think for smaller organizations, you have to be willing to bring new skills onto the board.
Yeah.
The board has to change as you scale. They had the advantage where they were already kind of moving, when they went out from the university, and so they were able to attract some people who could grow to the kind of scale they were aspiring to, but you have to be able and willing to change it up and match your skills.